All right, so I'm going to make this very easy for some of you out there and very difficult for the rest of you, because there are really just two types of people who should be looking at the Sony A9 III. There are going to be those of you who really need 120 frames per second RAW files, and those of you who don't. And for those of you who need it, you probably know who you are, but if you need some help, it's basically, it's people who need to photograph a moment. And the difference between that perfect moment and the not so perfect moment is measured in 1/100th of a second. And if so, you probably can use this camera. And that's going to mean basically sports photographers, probably some wildlife photographers. And for you, I don't care if Sony had put the shutter button on the bottom of the camera, the battery life was like 10-20 minutes, it wouldn't matter. This is still going to be so life-changing that you would still want to buy this camera. And I mean, still watch the video, but you could basically click that purchase link first and then watch the video. But I'm willing to bet that there are also a bunch of you who don't fall into that category. I'm going to be one of them. And you're going to be watching this video because there's a lot more to this camera. There's no banding, there's no rolling shutter, there's virtually unlimited flash sync speeds. It's an 80,000th of a second shutter. There's 4K 120 uncropped video, and that's just scratching the surface. And there's just basically a ton of upgrades from any other camera on the market. But there are going to be a few asterisks and maybe even a few areas that other cameras, even other Sony cameras, might perform better. And with the A9 III kind of coming in at a much higher price than I expected, that might make the decision of actually buying this camera a bit more complicated. So obviously I don't have the A9 III right now. I did spend just over 24 hours in New York with it, and I got to use it for sports, video. My wife was able to get some portraits in. We also did a little bit of low light testing and some landscape style shots, just basically whatever we could squeeze in that 24 hours. I should have it back soon though, so obviously a full review is going to be on the way. And then keep in mind that this was a pre-production unit, so we can't open raw files just yet. So we're going to leave most of like the image quality tests for when the production unit comes in. But there are quite a few takeaways, and even all of that intro was shot on the A9 III, so let's break it down. Now, I actually didn't expect too many changes on the hardware, but there is a bit more going on than I even expected. And if I could sum it up, it's basically like a perfect blend between the latest A7R5 and the Sony A1, which is what I'm actually using as my main camera right now, with a few extra features that really might make this one of the best Sony hardware cameras on the market today. And I think even if you're coming from like Nikon or Canon, there's quite a bit going on that you're going to like. And the easiest to spot is going to be the 4th axis flip screen, which Sony introed on the A7R5. It's easily my favorite design. It's also up to 3.2 inches, which is just slightly larger than the 3 inches that Sony usually uses. The resolution is also very good on the screen. I still don't think it's one of the best looking screens, which I've always been surprised at because Sony makes amazing TVs, but it's good enough, and it does have plenty of detail in it. The viewfinder though, this has extremely high resolution at over 9 million dots. And something new is that you actually get that full resolution in the viewfinder at up to 120 frames per second for a refresh rate. You can even go to 240 frames per second if you don't mind a slight quality hit, but 120 frames per second at 9 million dots, it feels like an optical viewfinder. And the rest of the hardware, it's just basically like a tweaked version of Sony's other cameras. But I will say, like, the edges, they're just a bit softer. The grip is going to be better. The shutter button, it's now kind of slanted a little bit more and in a better location. You also have a custom button now at the front, which will actually be very important with this camera. And for the ports, you have pretty much everything that you should need. You have a PC sync port, you have Ethernet port, USB-C, you have your full-size HDMI, and then you have all of your audio ports, a mic and a headphone out. And then on the other side, we have dual cards that can take either CF Express, type A or SD cards. You can fit both in either card slot. And on other Sony cameras like this one right here, it's really nice to be able to just use two different card types. But keep in mind, on this camera, it might be a little bit different. Sony CF Express type A cards are also like really expensive. $600 for 300 gigs right now, which is insane. They also aren't as fast as the cheaper CF Express type B cards that like Canon and Nikon use. And with the A9 III, if you're shooting anything over 30 frames per second, you're basically just going to need CF Express type cards. SD was just way too slow. Even the CF Express cards just maxed themselves out by this camera. So maybe Sony just needs to start innovating their card speeds, and that's really going to push the camera even further. And I will say that it's by far my personal favorite Sony body, but I don't use gloves and I don't use a 400mm f2.8 lens. So I wouldn't be surprised if like typical sports and wildlife photographers find just these kind of gaps in between these lenses just a bit cramped, especially with those kind of larger lenses. But obviously the most important part about this camera is going to be the sensor, which is now a global shutter. And that means instead of what most sensors do, which is read the sensor one line at a time, every time you take a picture, it's actually going to be reading instantaneously. So immediately when you hit that shutter button, the entire image is taken off a sensor. That means that there is no physical shutter because you don't need one. That's one less part to wear out. Not the only camera without a physical shutter though, but there is going to be no rolling shutter. It's eliminated. Banding is gone. You can shoot 120 frames per second in 24 megapixel RAW, which is absolutely insane. Like, I don't want to underestimate the value of this. This is just, it's massive. You're basically guaranteed to get the right moment every time. So this alone just revolutionized sports, even high-speed wildlife photography. So I think you're going to start seeing this camera pop up like crazy in stadiums after this. It was actually so fast that I was shooting video, slow motion video using raw images, which is just nuts. And Sony made this way more useful now because you can actually map that new custom button that's right in the front of your camera to go from a slower frame rate to a faster frame rate. So if you want those 120 frames per second or even 60 frames per second, just in bursts for split seconds, you can do it. You can basically shoot in 15 frames per second or 10 or 1 and then quickly just and then pop off a couple of images in super high speeds. But this global sensor also means that banding is going to be gone. Flickering is also a non-issue anymore. So most artificial lights, they still might flicker. It's just instead of seeing maybe that top of the frame, it's going to be bright and the bottom is going to be dim because it flickered during that exposure. Now you're going to have the entire flickering light. So basically the entire frame will be affected evenly, whatever the light is doing. But if you do have lights that just flicker like crazy, it's pretty rare. But if you do, you can set the camera to detect the flicker and only shoot when the lights are at its brightest. And the other massive feature in this camera is that you can actually set the shutter speed up to an 80,000th of a second, which is a rather really just absolutely insane mind-bending number. But realistically though, also a 16,000th of a second is going to be a little bit more practical that you might want to limit yourself to. And that's because if you do want to shoot with apertures wider than f1.8, I do believe continuous autofocus might be affected here as well. 16,000th of a second is going to be the cap for you to be able to get those super wide aperture lenses. It's still a number that sounds amazing, but there is a catch, which we're going to get to in a second. And another feature that those of you who need to capture sweat beads flying mid-flight is going to be the flash sync speed, which can also now go up to the full 80,000th of a second shutter without needing high-speed sync. And there are going to be a few asterisks with this as well. But in general, this is going to be a massive feature, especially for anyone who uses flash with moving subjects. Again, it's going to be a lot of sports and wildlife photographers. Now, as far as the image quality goes, we actually can't process RAW files right now, soon. So I did shoot RAW, so it's coming up soon. But I basically can't gauge low light and dynamic range fully. So you're going to need to wait for the full review for that one, which if you haven't subbed yet, if you haven't turned on notifications, now might be the time. And I will actually respond to your comments. So hit me up if you guys have any questions on the camera. I'm also posting some stuff over on IG if you want to hit me up there. Basically things that you want me to test when I do get in the full production version. But there are some really interesting things going on here that could affect image quality overall. And the first is that the base ISO for this is now 250 in stills, which is pretty high for a camera like this. Usually it's ISO 100, some are even a little bit lower. This might be good if you want to shoot indoors, but if you do want to shoot outdoors, this is where those asterisks start to become a little bit of a big deal. And this can be lowered to ISO 125 if you're not in the high speed shooting mode. If you're in high speed, you're going to be stuck at 250. But this does mean that you're not going to get the full dynamic range in quality. Again, I don't know how much quality is going to be affected if you go below the base ISO, something that we're going to test, but the base ISO is going to be ISO 250. So my wife, Sally, who's a portrait and wedding photographer, she did take out the A9 III to grab a few portraits while we were there. And even on a super overcast day, she was pushing a 4,000th of a second at ISO 250 on that Sony 50mm f1.2, which is the favorite lens for both of us, honestly. So she'll easily push past 16,000th of a second shutter once that sun comes out. So overall, quality from the JPEG images, it's solid. Color from Sony has improved quite a bit over the years. I also think like 24 megapixels is a good sweet spot for being just enough resolution to use for just about anything without going crazy on the file sizes. And typically global shutters haven't been known for like dynamic range and low light. So I will be testing that with the raw files, but I definitely wasn't noticing any red flags with the quality. So even though it probably won't be Sony's best quality sensor, definitely the fastest though by quite a bit, it might be much better or closer to Sony's other cameras than I originally expected. And I'm wondering if maybe the higher base ISO is intentional to kind of make up for the fact that typically global shutters aren't great in low light performance. So they made the base ISO 250 to make it better perform at those higher ISOs. I don't know, maybe not. We're going to test this, but either way, there's a lot of insane benefits to having a global shutter, even if it does push the ISO just a bit. Now, there isn't a whole lot new going on with autofocus, but that's not going to be an issue on this because first of all, depending on who you ask, Sony already has the best, maybe the second best autofocus system on the market, but I tend to lean towards the best, especially when it comes to photographing people. And that's because we saw a ton of improvements with Sony's AI tracking. I don't like calling it that, but that's what it's called on the Sony a7R5, which does an absolutely amazing job recognizing subjects, especially if you're tracking subjects where it might be tough to actually see the eye, which happens quite a bit with sports. And all of those improvements are on the A9 III. So like 2 days ago, I was actually shooting some race car drivers and they were wearing helmets, and I was shooting with mostly the A1 and the A7S III. I couldn't get those cameras to find the eye on these guys for the life of me. But the Sony a7R5, when I shot helmets with that, had absolutely no issues. And that's using this more advanced AI technology, autofocus technology that will be in the A9 III. Plus the A9 III is actually able to calculate or recalculate autofocus up to 120 frames per second. So even when we were pushing these crazy limits, shooting 60 and 120 frames per second, the autofocus system, and this is a pre-production camera, had no issues keeping up. Now, I was a bit worried about the buffer. If you could actually shoot 120 frames per second long enough for it to be useful. And it's mostly good news here. So you're not going to like sit down and just crank the shutter for 5 seconds, but you are going to have enough to capture the moment. It's basically you have just over a second at full speed. Plus there is a pre-record. So basically the camera can be automatically shooting in the background. You won't even know about it. And then as soon as you hit the shutter, up to a second before you hit the shutter can be captured. And this you can just make sure that you don't hit that moment. Also, once the buffer is filled up, you can still shoot. It just slows it down a little bit. Now, Sony does have an uncompressed RAW, a lossless compressed, and a fully compressed RAW, and the buffer seemed to clear a bit more quickly if you use that compressed RAW option, which I think most people are going to be absolutely fine with. Maybe like 10 to 12 seconds when you're pushing CF Express. Now, if you're using SD cards, it is extremely slow. So plan on only using CF Express if you're doing anything super high speed. But let's talk about a few quirks because there's a lot going on here. And I do have what we'll call maybe a part 2 on the A9 III, going into a little bit more in depth on these concepts like the global shutter, why it matters, how the flash sync speed works, how it compares to the A9 II and other cameras, and a lot of other nerdy stuff on these asterisks, because this is a brand new sensor tech and there's a lot going on here. However, remember that I said a 16,000th of a second. Shutter speed sounds really fast. It's actually double what most cameras can do. This is an 8,000th of a second, but most cameras have a base ISO of 100, and the minimum on the A9 III is going to be 250. So you would actually need a 20,000th of a second shutter to stop the same amount of light as another camera like the A7R5. So if you're someone who's shooting daytime portraits, for example, with a 50mm 1.2, and you typically have too much light, you're going to be cranking that aperture and using an ND filter on the A9 III a bit more often or a bit earlier than on other cameras. Also, that flash. So again, being able to sync at basically any shutter speed without using high-speed sync sounds impressive, especially if you're shooting outside in the sun or using flash with high-speed action. However, that 250 base ISO also means that you need 2.5 times faster shutter speeds just to match a normal camera like the A7R5 or A1. That's going to make it much harder if you're trying to like overpower the sun with your lights. Then you have to keep in mind that in theory, you can sync at any shutter speed, but depending on what light you use, you might not be able to get all of the light from that flash or from that strobe in your camera at every shutter speed. So all lights have some duration. Most flashes are typically like 1,000th of a second. Some are going to be faster. Some strobes are going to be much slower. And in the past, the camera shutter sync speeds were always a limitation. But now in the A9 III, the shutter is faster than the speed of light dumping from your strobe. And so this means that even if a strobe can technically sync at those higher sync speeds, your strobe might not actually be fast enough to dump the full power of the light that fast. So it's going to be interesting to see how this handles especially multiple strobes, and especially if you have different strobes at different power. So maybe your main light is full power, but your background lights are slower power. Those might dump power much faster, dump light faster than your main lights, which are on full power. So this is going to be interesting to see how it goes. Again, in most applications where this camera shines, having faster sync speeds without needing high speed sync, 120 frames per second, the global shutter, those are just things that are so good. A minimum ISO of 250 instead of 100, and nobody's going to care about that at all. In fact, for most sports and wildlife, you're probably better off at higher ISOs or having a higher minimum ISO anyway. So I don't think this is an issue at all for the people who this camera is really geared for. It's more the rest of us, like people like me who are seeing tech this impressive that we just immediately want in. But what we're probably going to find out when we do get production units is that people like landscape photographers, maybe portrait photographers, would probably be better off with cameras like the A7R5, Canon R5, Nikon Z8, things like that, because they're going to have better dynamic range, a lower base ISO, and the A9's crazy flash sync speeds. Those really only help for like action flash photography, but might not help for like portrait flash photography, especially outdoors. But keep in mind that if you do plan on shooting over 60 frames per second, only Sony's newer lenses can actually autofocus at the full 120 frames per second, and third-party lenses will not shoot faster than 15 frames per second. So lens selection is going to be pretty important here. Now, it's probably going to be more interesting is video, and that's because in so many ways, this is actually the best Sony video camera. It's a dream camera in so many ways. So you have the latest autofocus technology, the latest video features. You have 4K 120 with no crop. You have 4K 60 that's oversampled, so insane detail there. You have the global shutter. You're never going to see rolling shutter again. Like that entire intro, I'm doing whip pans, crazy moves. There's absolutely no rolling shutter, no banding. And even if you do have like just a flicker from photography flashes, it looks so much better when you have a global shutter because you don't have this like half frame that's lit and the other half looking like crap. And if you think that's awesome, then you start to realize that instead of shooting video, you can shoot 24 megapixel raw images up to 120 frames per second and get 14-bit raw video with insane dynamic range in 5 times slow motion. And this is just like mind-numbing detail. But there is a small limitation, and again, it's going to be that minimum ISO. So in video, if you're shooting an S-Log3, the lowest ISO is 2000. And so anything except like really low light stuff is going to pretty much need an ND filter, especially if you're using like wide aperture lenses. So typically I'd rarely pull out like a 6-9 stop VND, but with the A9 III, it might be the one that I use the most. And so most of my footage that I shot, I actually had to crank the shutter quite a bit. I wasn't expecting that high of a base ISO. Now, something that's really interesting. So I actually expected this camera to have issues at higher ISOs because Sony wouldn't tell me if there was like a dual ISO or second ISO with a lower noise floor, but I was noticing what looks like better performance around 6400 ISO in log. So again, I'm going to need to test this on a pre or actual production camera unit because I couldn't confirm this with Sony, but that would be awesome. And it looks to me like there is a second usable ISO in log. And if it's 6400, this is a high ISO. In the past, global shutters haven't had the best dynamic range. So I'm curious to see how that stacks up with like the A1 and the A7S III. So trust me, I'm going to be testing all of that. But after shooting with it for the day, I came away just way more impressed than I expected to be. I'm still a little bummed that we don't have things like native 6K recording, open gate. There's no internal ProRes or RAW recording or anything like that. These are things that Panasonic, even Nikon is doing on much cheaper cameras. Technically, the A9 III wasn't designed as a video camera, so I'll give it a little pass. But if we don't see things like that on the FX4, I'm going to be a little less forgiving on that. But there is something else we need to talk about, and that's going to be the price. And there's really one reason that this price is a potential issue. And the reason is that this is an A9 III, which means there was an A9 II. And so $6,000, which is the price of the A9 III, and inflation is super bad right now, but the A9 II, that was $4,500. So justifying a 30% price hike for the latest camera, that's not typical. But this is not your typical upgrade. So the A9 III can shoot blackout free images 4 times faster than any other camera on the market. 6 times faster than the A9 II with no banding, no rolling shutter, what's arguably the best autofocus system on the market right now. So if you take that into account, spending $6,000 for tech that I never thought we would see this soon, it's well worth whatever organ you need to sell in order to get it. So typically with an upgrade, it's pretty unusual to see a 6 times performance increase, a technological evolution in a single generation. But remember, this is a tool in the hands of photographers whose job it is to freeze time and capture a moment that happens once in a lifetime. And from that perspective, the A9 III is an absolute revolution. And that doesn't mean that you can't shoot award-winning images at 1 frame per second. I mean, the pyramids were built with a chisel. And I know there's a lot of you out there who are just going to say, who needs this kind of stuff? But this is a better tool. And the better tool means it's going to be easier, it's going to be faster and more reliable. And it just puts you that much closer to never missing the moment that you want. And every time you want it, you should get that shot. And for that, Sony deserves whatever award this camera can possibly qualify for. But at the same time, because of the global shutter and the new higher price that comes along with it, it might be a sports wildlife photographer dream camera, but for a lot of other people, it might not have been the camera you had hoped for, because I created an A9 III predictions video, and most of you who commented on that video, you wanted more resolution, a sub $5,000 price, and a lot of other features that are actually not in the camera. And you might have even given up that global shutter if Sony had those things in it. So did Sony even get it right? Is 120 frames per per second and an 80,000th of a second shutter speed worth it for you to win you over? And I do have more tests on the A9 III on the way. I actually just took another camera out for some insane race cars and actually drove them around the track. So new video coming soon on that. BTS over on IG. I have tons more videos dropping soon, guys. So I appreciate the like and the sub. I'll see you guys soon in a new video.